Hello everyone. This is a video lecture explaining the process of how to develop an effective outline for the fear essay. Alright, what you see in front of you is the start of a rough outline, and I do recommend that for any of the outlines that you're asked to do in this class that you always start out with a rough outline first, basically because the format of it is freer. There are fewer rules, or really no rules, and so it's kind of like having your own sandbox where you can move ideas around rather easily. You can cut and paste, and it's just a lot more of a free-form way of organizing the content and kind of working out the kinks before you transfer that into a more formal outline that I'll collect a little bit later and that will work with. But what I have here is I have a very basic sample working thesis, and when you have a rough outline, basically what you do is you open up a blank file and you put just kind of a descriptive title in the middle. And so for this one I just put rough outline for the fear essay. At the very top of the page, you want to put your working thesis, and for me, I like to put mine in bold just so I can emphasize it, because as I am creating the rough outline, I want to constantly look at the thesis so that I can make sure that my big body points are actually tying into that. Now, I chose this thesis and the fill-in-the-blank method just because it illustrates what I need to illustrate a little bit easier, but the same principles apply even for those students who have a thesis that's got a broader statement, kind of using the umbrella method. So for this example, I have the thesis that says we can overcome our fears through pretense, exposure therapy, and logical analysis. And right now I kind of just have a placeholder, and I'm kind of using bullets to indicate the various sections of the paper. And so for this one though, I want to make sure that my big body sections in the rough outline match with the language in each of the blanks for the working thesis. So I've got overcoming fears through pretense. So notice that my first big body section is going to have that technique, overcoming fear through pretense. Then my next body section, which describes the technique of exposure therapy, then my next point needs to be overcoming fear through exposure therapy. And then of course the last one is logical analysis, and so I need to have that phrase or something equivalent to that in this next body point. So that's one of the first things I do. I put placeholders for the introduction and the conclusion. Then I will put kind of bullet points for each of the main sections that are going to be in the outline. And then I start to sort which sources I'm going to use. Now, sources are never the same thing as points in the outline, but when I'm very first beginning on the rough outline, I'm starting to figure out which sources am I going to use to develop this point, which ones am I going to use for this one, and so on. And I start moving those around so I know which pieces of sources that I can use in those various parts. Now once I do that, I'll go back and kind of erase Class Act and erase Amy Cuddy TED Talk, and I'll put the points there, and I'll put the author's name out to the side. But to me this is always a beginning point, and then what I'll do is I'll come in here and I'll put specific. Again, I'll change this, instead of having the source, and I'll put the points that I want to, illustrate about overcoming fear through pretense. And then under those points, I will put examples that I want to use from the sources, and also put examples that I want to use not from my own personal life, because we can't use personal experience in academic essays, but the kinds of examples that I can think of that may bridge the gap between what the people in the sources are talking about and things that maybe regular people can identify with, so that hopefully in the body sections I can inspire or show my readers how these techniques can be applied to their lives, that they're not just for these people who are astronauts and successful business people and so on. I want to kind of bridge the gap and show how we can apply these things in our lives as well. So that's step number one. Always start out with the rough outline and kind of rough out the points. And the reason why you want to do this is because as the rough outline becomes more involved, so this is just the very first part, don't have a whole one done here, but as it becomes more involved, I'm going to need to move things around because I'm likely to make mistakes or have overlap or have things in one section that really go in another, and it allows me to move the puzzle pieces around. But this is step one. Now let me jump to an outline that's a little bit more fleshed out and show you what we're aiming for by the time you get ready to turn in an outline to me. Okay, what you see now is a formal outline with a little bit more of a fleshed out approach than what we saw before in the start of the rough outline. Keep in mind that before you make the formal outline, you will flesh out the rough outline a little bit more so that you have some details to work with. But this is what the formal outline will look like, and it has more rules and requirements to it. Notice that I have a heading here, it's double spaced, and I have a descriptive title for the outline. Something like formal outline for the FEAR essay is perfectly fine. I went ahead and double spaced it so that it's in MLA format, and so we can get practice in that, and also just so it's a little bit easier to read the outline. It's also color-coded. This is something that I do ask students to do in my classes, and I'll explain why. It's based on the same premise as the reason why I ask you to color code in your notes as well. What you see in black would be things that are derived from the sources, or things that don't necessarily particularly come from the writer, in this case me. And the things that are color-coded will be the things that represent your contribution to the outline. And the reason why I ask you to do this in the notes, and the reason why I ask you to do this in the outline, is so that you can see your presence in the process. If you're not thinking about the content that you're reading about and responding and reacting and figuring out how you're going to use that, if your presence isn't in the notes and you're not interacting with the ideas, it's going to be a lot harder for you to insert your presence in the paper later. And the same thing is true for the outline. The outline is your plan for how you will approach drafting the paper. So if all you have in the outline are points and examples from the sources, well then where are you? And it may be harder for you to inject your presence in the paper if you're not figuring out, well, where are you going to come into play in the outline. So you'll notice in the outline I do ask that you have a plan for each section of the paper, and that doesn't mean that the plan can't change later. It absolutely can. You may change your idea for your approach to the introduction. You're allowed to do that. You may decide when you're drafting to still move things around or cut a point or switch out an example, and you can absolutely do that. So the point of an outline is not to create a plan that's so ironclad that you're not allowed to revise it on the fly or make any changes, but the idea is that you've done enough careful thinking about how you want to approach the paper so that you have a logical plan that will at least lead to a successful rough draft. Because the more successful the draft is, then we have kind of more of a framework to work with moving forward. And we'll still have lots of work cut out for us in terms of revising the paper and improving it, but the outline is what will prevent writer's block. It will streamline the drafting, and it will ensure, if it's logical, at least a logical progression of the paper. So let's look at some things, and they should match up with what we saw on the rough outline. So we said before that our working thesis was that we can overcome some of our fears through pretense, exposure therapy, and logical analysis. And just like the parts of the thesis needed to match up with the big Roman numerals, we'll see that here as well. So our first big point needs to be in alignment with the first one that we list in our thesis. If we have an umbrella thesis, then the order isn't suggested, but you will still have to think about what order you want your points to be in. But for this one, it illustrates the point quite nicely. So we've got through pretense. And then if we scroll down to, the next body section, it'll be dealing with fear through deliberate and repeated exposure or exposure therapy. So I need to scroll back up here and make sure, okay, I've got exposure therapy here in the second position, so that's matching up with my second point. And then if I were to scroll down further, then my last, kind of big point or section in the outline would be the one that says logical analysis. So when we're looking at our own outlines and we're looking to evaluate other people's outlines, we need to look at this first. You need to look at the thesis. And if it's a fill-in-the-blank thesis like this, and you see, oh, we can overcome our fears through pretense, or if you're looking at the other prompt, the lessons that we can learn from fear or from our response to it, then you need to see, well, what lessons are listed here, and are those lessons reflected in the big Roman numerals? And if they're not, those are things that you need to comment on and provide suggestion for, so that students can fix that. And if you notice these things in your own outline, then you know, oh, hey, I need to go back and I need to fix that. I need to have this notion of overcoming fears through pretense as my first point here. If you've got an umbrella thesis, you still have to look at, if you're dealing with this particular prompt, do I have the strategies or techniques listed here? Are they clear? Are they specific? And if they're not, you'll need to look under here and see, well, which sources are they using? And if it's not clear up here, you need to provide suggestions. So you'll need to ask yourself, well, what kind of techniques or strategies are revealed in the sources that they chose? And if you can extract some, then you can say, hey, here's some ideas of the phrasing that you could use for the technique or strategy that they're using. So this is the first order of business in terms of determining whether the outline makes sense in terms of the big points presented. So you look at the thesis first and the big points, which will be on the big Roman numerals, first. If those don't make sense or if they're not clear, that's where you start. Then you start looking to see if what goes underneath really matches what goes up here. So let's see if it matches with what goes up here, and if it doesn't, that's something that needs to be commented on, or if you're self-evaluating your own outline, that's something that needs to be fixed. So the first point is dealing with fear by pretense, kind of a fake it till you make it kind of method. So the first thing is a point that I have kind of established or extracted from the readings, but it's something that I have put in, it's kind of my own point here. It's the notion of facing our fears in action in spite of being fearful. So it's not this notion of being fearless, it's just, kind of having an ability to act despite being afraid, and the technique for doing that is dealing with fear by pretense. So now the stuff you see in black is coming from the Roosevelt source. So this would be the Class Act little article, which is an excerpt from Theodore Roosevelt's autobiography. So these things are ideas or examples that I'm using from the sources. So in your outline, I ask you for the things that you're bringing in from the sources, that those things stay in black, so we can tell that the things that are in black, okay, those things are from the sources, and you'll label them out to the side with the author's name, just so I can see how many sources you're using in the paper, and you can too, and then the color coding shows your presence relative to the use of the source material. So I'm going to bring in these points from Roosevelt, and he talks about feigning confidence as a mean to achieving it for real. So he kind of advocates for a, kind of go in there and do the duties that you need to do, act like you are courageous or whatever, and that will allow you to do the things that you need to do. And over time and repetition, he claims that that will, eventually turn into kind of a more genuine, authentic kind of confidence, instead of just, the fearfulness. And then he talks about the repetition in practice and the benefits of that, how it desensitizes us to fear, leads toward the authentic confidence. And then I want to transition to applying this principle to fear of public speaking and or the imposter syndrome, because I also want to use another source in this section, and that would be the Amy Cuddy TED Talk. So when you have an outline, what it does is it shows you where and how things can, line up. So here in this case, I've got this one point, which is, I can already tell, going to take more than one paragraph, and I've envisioned using two different sources because they both essentially talk about using this method of, kind of dealing with your fear through pretense, kind of a fake it till you make it. And then Cuddy kind of takes it a step further and says, fake it till you become it. But she applies it specifically to the fear of public speaking and kind of to our feelings of self-worth and confidence, and how those things can be influenced by our body language. Our body language is generally something that other people use to formulate opinions about ourselves. They look at how we carry ourselves and things like that, and that influences their perception of us. But she demonstrates through her research that our body language can also influence how we perceive ourselves, and so on. And so I would use the things that I list here, and then notice the stuff that's in blue here that says how we can apply this concept in our lives. This is important. You're going to have to do this in all the sections of your paper. So it's not just about your ability to paraphrase what the sources say about either techniques for overcoming or mitigating, managing fear. And it's not just about your ability to paraphrase about the lessons we can learn if you're writing about the other prompt, but it's also about, well, how does this apply to us? Because, your readers want to know how this applies to their lives and under what circumstances these things can apply to their lives. So you have to relate all these things that you talk about to your audience. So I plan to talk about these things, that we can apply these concepts in job interviews and at work, in college and at school, because Cuddy talks about both of these things, not only in her experience as a researcher, but also in her experience as a student herself and later as a professor. I think we've all felt a little bit out of our element or nervous or maybe not as confident as we would have liked in job interviews or at work and in college and at school. And I also want to tie that to the notion that we could use this in really any kind of circumstance we're afraid to speak, take action, or be heard. And to the extent that you can, you also want to, when you're cleaning things up and putting it in a formal outline, and you can even start to do this in your rough outline in the stage before this one, is think about, well, how am I going to connect to the next thing that I'm going to talk about? How will I transition from one section to the other? And again, that doesn't mean that you can't change your mind when you get there. Maybe I decide to move some things around, but I know that Roosevelt kind of got his idea that he talks about in his autobiography, because he says as a boy he read a book about a soldier, about a captain who was explaining to one of his men about how to be brave in battle, when your life is in danger, and how to do your duty as a soldier in spite of being afraid. And so that always struck Roosevelt as a boy, and it stuck with him kind of in his mind for the rest of his life. And it's something that he called on in his own life and applied in his own life. And it's something that he called on and applied as president, especially when he was put in the position of having to, speak to, as the commander-in-chief, to speak to the military and, talk to them about how it is possible to do your duty even when your life is in danger, and you might be fearful, and rightfully so because of that. And so he applied those things, but he got the idea from reading in a book. So I kind of I have the idea right now that I could use that idea to transition to the section on exposure therapy and Jia Zhang, because where did he get his idea to use a specific technique to overcome his fear of rejection? By reading about it on the internet. So I want to use the concept of reading to tie these two sections together, and about, kind of use that as a transitional device, and also to maybe kind of remind us that sometimes when we don't know how to do something, that's okay. We often don't know or don't have the tools on our own, but oftentimes if we ask, or if we take the time to read or extract things from the things that we read, we might find some useful things that we could apply in our own lives. So you're always looking for what kind of, something can I use as a transitional device between sections. So this is the purpose of an outline. And so when you have a good set of notes and when you have a good outline that is logical, and it's so logical that you don't need a teacher or a professor to validate it and say, yeah, this is logical, go ahead and write the draft. You can look at it and you know, this is good, it's logical, it's clear. You can hand it to somebody in your family and they're like, yeah, I get this, it's clear. You should be good to go. Then, you're onto something. Because my goal in this class is to give you the tools and the strategies so that when you're out of this class and somebody else gives you, a paper or an assignment, you have some strategies that you can draw on. And certainly you can modify these strategies to suit your preferences. Maybe you decide that a rough outline in the future is all that you really need for a paper. And if so, that's fine. But just notice that, when you have the logic, when you have the detail, when you've taken the time to plan everything out, this is what eliminates writer's block. What happens with writer's block is you sit down, and I can say this because I know, I've been there, I've done that, where you write with bad habits. You didn't take notes, you've just got your articles and you've got those spread out in front of you on your bed or on a desk. You kind of have a vague idea. I got to write a paper about how to overcome fear. And if you're just writing with your articles and you don't really have a plan and you're just kind of winging it, I'm not saying you can't write a paper, and I'm not saying that you can't write, a paper where you say a lot of good things. But the danger that you possibly might run into is that you might say some great things, but if it's not organized, you can say something on page 2 and on page 6, but you don't remember that you've kind of repeated yourself because you didn't, get everything organized before you started writing. And so you may have good things, but it may be not organized to best advantage. You may ramble, you may miss the best examples because you didn't take the time to process sources deeply, which is what note-taking allows you to do. You process the sources deeply and you know them better than you would otherwise, and you also know what you think about them better, and you can generally envision how you might want to use those sources to best advantage. So, even though the taking of the notes and the creating of the outline might slow down the front end of the process, where the payoff is on the back end of the process. And to illustrate that, I'll give a brief analogy. And that's, in cooking. If you do the prep work first, if you chop all the onions, dice the tomatoes, get all your spices out and measure those things kind of like they do in the cooking shows, and then if you've got a lot going on, a lot of moving parts in the meal, it sure is a lot easier to throw it together or to keep up with, the 4 pots you have on the stove and the 2 things you have in the oven. Is if you kind of have a plan and you've done all the prep work, then the process of executing the meal goes a lot more smoothly than it would if you're trying to figure things out on the fly and you don't really have an organized way of approaching it. That's kind of the same thing that's here. So these are some things that you need to think about in terms of the process to follow for creating the outline. I do advocate and suggest that you take a good set of formal notes on all the sources that you want to use. It really does streamline the process, and it reduces the amount of text that you work with. Remember, I'll reiterate one thing from the written notes that are in the unit, and that is this. If you have 6 or 7 sources, and let's just pretend they're 10 pages each to make the math simple, that's 60 or 70 pages that you would have to flip through if you're trying to write a paper. And if you're in a hurry, you're likely to choose things randomly, perhaps misuse things, miss the best examples, and so on. But if you take notes, you're gravitating toward the examples that you find most compelling. You're adding your own insights and thoughts. You're making connections to other sources. You're seeing how those things line up. And so, like, let's say if my notes are 10 pages in total out of, all of those sources. I don't know about you, but if I'm writing my paper, I'd rather deal with 10 pages of my notes where I've already chosen all the good stuff from the sources that I think I might want to use, and a really good outline so that I've got less clutter on my desk. I've got less text that I have to work with, and I'm more likely to make better choices and it'll streamline the draft and make my life easier when it comes time to writing the draft. So I recommend the notes, creating a rough outline with the bullet points and no rules, just kind of so you can move things around and flesh that out, kind of figure out what you want in there, and then take the time. This is what I'm asking for, the part that you will turn into me in Blackboard. And for us in this class, we are doing this through the discussion activity. So this is what I'm asking for on the discussion activity. You turn in a file with your formal outline, and that it be color coded like this, and that you have labeled out to the side all of the things that you are using from each of the sources. I should see all of the required sources in the outline, and at least 3 of them should be print sources. You're welcome to have extra sources from the ones that are chosen in the unit, but at least 3 need to be print, and the other 3 can be TED, and again, you can have extra, and this is what we'll be working with when we also make the peer review comments on each other's outlines. So that's it. That's a wrap. That's what we're aiming for this week, and the week is pretty much clear. This is what we're focusing on, so you should have plenty of time to pull out all the stops and do your absolute best and put your all your effort into not only creating a good outline and a good set of notes, but also taking some time to really evaluate and offer concrete specific suggestions to your classmates. That's it. That's a wrap. Y'all have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.